Hi, I'm Brooke Orr. I'm registered dietitian and certified eating disorder specialist and a mom of two. I'm also the creator of the Women's Collective podcast, a space where women can get evidence-based answers to their health questions while connecting with supportive, like-minded women navigating similar experiences. Today, I'm joined by Jenn Salib, author of Eating to Thrive During Menopause. She's also a registered dietitian, a naturopathic doctor, intuitive eating counselor, and someone who is deeply passionate about helping women thrive in midlife and beyond. Jenn, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Brooke. It's great to be here.
So, I'm excited for our audience to get to hear all of this amazing research you've done. I've enjoyed your book. And before we get into the science, I was hoping you could share a little bit of your own journey with dieting and body image kind of earlier in life.
Yeah, and like so many, people, puberty was a very challenging time for me and my body image. And I often share that I really wish I had known that our body fat percentage would need to double in order to, start menstruating. So, like many others, I started dieting right around puberty, 11 or 12, and really continued that, through my teen years and well into my 20s and 30s. And so I had an eating disorder, but also very disordered eating after that. And that is what really led me to want to learn about nutrition and integrative healthcare. And because I was trying to fix myself. So my own journey, like so many other dietitians, was that, I was trying to learn everything I could about nutrition so that I could fix myself. And then perimenopause crash landed into my life at 37. And that's when I say, like, the wheels fell off. And I'm so grateful that it did, because it was at that point that I really had to ask myself, is this did this ever work? It's not working now, but did it ever work? And that really was the invitation for me to, try and learn something different. And I was introduced to intuitive eating and then pursue the intuitive eating certification. And I guess the rest is history. So it was really the perimenopause and early perimenopause at 37 was kind of that intersection for me.
Yeah, and so I mean, being a dietitian and the naturopathic doctor, you had all this science-based information, but it seems like that didn't necessarily translate to quote unquote diet success, which I feel like we see a lot in the research as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think anybody who has tried dieting, most of them will have the lived experience of, I'm doing everything right. I don't understand why it's not working. And like many others, my first diet worked, and then progressively stopped working. And so I think that's really what I, had to confront was my lived experience is not what I expect it to be, because what I thought I needed was more information. So I just kept seeking new information. And yet that was not helping me to feel better in my body, about my body, or really improve my health in any meaningful way.
Why do you think it's been so hard for healthcare practitioners? I mean, I'm a dietitian, so I'm in that group as well, to catch up to that lived experience versus, research. I mean, because still, when a person in perimenopause, menopause goes to the doctor, most of the time what they're told is, oh, you're gaining weight, so you're going to need to cut calories, or you're going to need to try this shot. Like, we have to change the weight. The weight is the problem. And it
Well,
feels like it's not
yeah,
helpful.
I mean, the weight regulation model of calories in, calories out, that law of thermodynamics is not wrong, but that only works or is only true or mostly true for a system that is in isolation. And human bodies are not closed systems. So if we were all, living in a lab where all of the variables around us were controlled, maybe that lived experience would reflect that equation. But for most of us, we can't control those variables to any degree for any amount of time that makes it feel like it's working. And so when we get into perimenopause, not only do we have shifting hormone levels, but we have shifting sleep. We have this convergence of other life things that are happening where activities of daily living might be changing, caregiving roles might be changing. We're not running around after toddlers as much. We might be more likely to be sitting with aging parents. So we have all of these things that are kind of coming together that, yes, our bodies are changing, but that doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong.
I think that's so important to hear because a lot of times it feels like failure when we can't
Yeah.
control the changes in our body.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I certainly felt that way when I couldn't, make the numbers work in the way that I wanted it to. But I think that's part of this kind of journey in midlife, is recognizing that our bodies are changing and will continue to change regardless. And if we can find a way to be maybe a bit more comfortable, we don't have to like it, we don't have to love it, but if we can be more comfortable with the change and not see it as something that we fear or something that creates urgency, then I think we're in a better position to be able to make those attuned changes or responses. So, that's where I think the gentle nutrition of intuitive eating comes in really nicely, because we can still talk about nutrition, which is what I like to talk about in my book. We can still talk about nutrition, but we don't have to make those changes revolve around weight.
Right. So it's sort of the health at every size model where you're working on behaviors to support good health, regardless of what the number on the scale says.
Yeah, exactly. And so another example or question that I'll often use when I'm working with people is they'll say, I've heard, let's talk about protein. I've heard that protein is so important. And do I need to be buying protein popcorn and putting protein powder in my coffee and things like that? And I'll say, well, in 5 years from now, will that decision still be really important? Is it going to make enough of a difference to your health today or in 5 years from now that you need to devote a lot of capacity to this decision?
Mm,
And most of the time, that puts it in perspective, right? So, adding a bit of extra protein to your plate in 5 years could make a big difference. Making it a full time job probably isn't.
right. So true. Well, so one thing you mentioned was at 37, you sort of started having these perimenopause symptoms, and that was considered early. I know for myself, even, I've talked to the doctor about different symptoms, and I've said, could this be perimenopause? And I'm 41, and they've said, oh, no, you're way too young.
Mm.
And so I feel like there's a lot of misdiagnoses or misinformation about perimenopause. So, like, how did you know you were in perimenopause?
Well, and your experience is one that I think a lot of listeners will certainly relate to. I hear it a lot from the people that I work with. And it's important to know that perimenopause is a reproductive stage, it is not an age. So you can be in perimenopause at 20 if you're someone who has, ovarian insufficiency. Um, Lots of people don't go into perimenopause until their 50s if they have lots of ovarian reserve. So perimenopause is the 5 to 10 years leading up to the last period. On average,
Mm,
it's 4 to 5 years. For me, it was, I think, 7.5. So really, we're looking at anybody who's over the age of 35 on average who is showing symptoms or signs of changes in their cycle, shortening, lengthening, skipping, heavier periods, more painful periods, new symptoms like breast tenderness or headaches is another one. But there are some signs and symptoms related to your cycle and also how you're feeling that we can use when combined with your personal and family history to say, this could be perimenopause. There isn't a test. So for me, I had 3 young kids under the age of 7, but I wasn't sleeping through the night. And I remember very distinctly complaining to my husband regularly, it is not fair that the kids have finally started sleeping through the night and I can't now. So that
yeah.
3 was very telltale for me. I was also having a lot of new onset anxiety, mood swings, but it wasn't until I started skipping a period that it kind of started to come together as, oh, this actually might be something else. And thankfully, I had a really good team around me that we were able to piece together the puzzle, as it were. But a lot of people slip through the cracks for years because
Yeah.
exactly like you're told, they're too young, or they're told they need to be having hot flashes, which is not at all a requirement. And so that's where the education piece comes in.
Okay. That's good to hear because it's like I feel like I'm checking boxes, but then if I'm too, and then, oh, you're too young, you're like, oh gosh, why am I having this early? So it's good to
Yeah.
know that it's not an age, it's a reproductive period.
Yeah.
And I do like what you said about, it's normal to gain weight, obviously, and body fat restores when you're an adolescent going through puberty, which people fight. And it sort of seems like the same thing happens in this menopausal area. I mean, it kind of feels like it's a repeating pattern. One you're starting and one you're kind of ending. But
Yeah.
there are those body shifts.
That's why some people call it, second puberty, reverse puberty, because we do see a lot of those similar shifts that are happening with puberty. That those changes are happening because your ovaries and your reproductive system is ramping up. In perimenopause, it is declining. And as a result of those shifting estrogen levels, we do get what I call a redistribution of assets, where people will move from maybe more of that like pear-shaped distribution of adiposity to more of an apple shape. Not everyone, but that certainly is a pattern that we see in the literature. And we also see that through that transition time, even many people do experience changes on the scale, but even for people who don't, that redistribution changes what you see in the mirror, which is the body image piece, especially the increased risk of body image and body dysmorphia in midlife that we're seeing. What you see in the mirror is your clothes don't fit the same, and what's described as just not feeling like yourself anymore becomes a regular refrain.
Yeah. And it's so hard. I mean, and one of the other things I know you mentioned in your book was that you can start to notice cholesterol increasing, insulin resistance, like you just said, body composition, but that doesn't mean that your diet and lifestyle changed.
Yeah,
How, like
exactly.
physiologically, what's kind of going on there that would cause cholesterol or to go up or insulin resistance or do we know?
Yeah, well, we do have kind of an inkling in that we have estrogen receptors throughout our body, including our liver. The most significant source of cholesterol is produced in the liver. It doesn't come from our diet. Diet has an influence, but it is not the driving factor for most people. So that is the association as our estrogen levels decline, that cholesterol production can ramp up in the liver. So we can see that happen. For some people, that stabilizes a bit post-menopause. For some people, it goes up a little bit. We also know that estrogen does have a protective role on blood vessels and endothelial function. So we can see things like blood pressure also increase a bit around the time of menopause. So that is a change in what I call our hormone soup. So the hormone soup that your body has been making on a regular basis for your reproductive life is now changing. Those adjustments can have impacts on our health. And I always say, like, it's disingenuous to say that they don't matter. They do matter, but it still doesn't mean that weight loss is the only or best way to pursue improvements in those health markers or health outcomes, which is why I love the intuitive eating kind of gentle nutrition approach, where we can say, okay, what can I do? What does the evidence say? And is there a behavior approach to this that doesn't rely on the number on the scale as a measure of success or failure?
Right. So, what are some of those behaviors that you recommend? I know you mentioned several in your book. One was plant forward, but what are some of the things you
Yeah.
recommend for behaviors?
Well, and when we think about the determinants of health, as I'm sure you know, and lots of others who might be listening, food, what we eat, how we move, those are certainly things that might be somewhat within our control. But a lot of the determinants of health are actually things that are outside of our control. And so when we're thinking about food, we want to make sure that it's proportional. And what I like about, including what I call these key ingredients is that we can add things and have these buckets of choices, plant forward being one of them, including maybe some soy foods more intentionally, including foods that are higher in fiber, calcium. These are investments that if we use that 5-year filter, 5 years from now, those could be making a difference, a significant difference in how you feel. Also in 20 years from now. But I like to use that add-in approach versus the takeaway nutrition by addition, so that we're really focused on not making it a rule and that we're just staying out of that all or nothing mindset.
I love nutrition by addition. That's a great little soundbite there as far as making it easier. So, we're adding things in, not taking away.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned was the soy component. And I know years ago, and there's still people who have fear around soy
Yeah.
because of the maybe misinformation or misinterpreted research around soy and breast cancer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I know you've looked into that pretty extensively. Tell me a little bit about what you found.
Yeah, and so when we hear soy, most people associate soy with estrogen, and soy does contain a type of phytoestrogen or plant-based estrogen-like compounds that are called isoflavones. These isoflavones have the ability to bind very weakly to one of our estrogen receptors. Now, as a result of that, 30 or 40 years ago, that was interpreted as them being estrogenic. But we actually have pretty good research now that tells us that while they do bind to the estrogen receptors, they don't increase estrogen levels. And so that's why we call them selective estrogen receptor modulators. And because they don't increase estrogen levels, they also don't increase the risk of hormone sensitive cancers or estrogen dependent cancers. And we have lots of good data to tell us that it does not increase the risk of breast cancer, it does not increase the risk of recurrence, and in almost all studies, a decreased risk for those cancers and most others as well.
That's great. Well, how often do you recommend adding in soy? And, at one point it was you needed to have organic, non-GMO. I mean, do those things matter?
So to the isoflavone content, they don't. I would call those values-based decisions. So if it's important to somebody to choose organic soy, then by all means choose organic soy. If we're talking about the impacts of soy on health, we don't have good data to say that that's an important factor in the decision-making process. So if somebody is looking to have some relief from hot flashes and night sweats, which is why I was wanting to include them, then we want to be looking at 1 or 2 servings a day. A serving being a cup of soy milk, 3.5 ounces or 100 grams roughly of tofu, those kinds of things. If people are looking to reduce their cholesterol with soy foods, so soy protein also has an approved claims in the US and Canada for reducing cholesterol levels. So we want to be looking at 25 grams of soy protein per day to help support healthier cholesterol levels. Which again, 25 grams of protein you're going to be looking at about 100 grams of tofu, just like give or take a few grams. So for most people, it depends on what they want to include it for. But if we're just including it as a plant forward choice, it can be however you enjoy it in whatever way it fits in your life. So lots of people have heard about or want to add more plants to their plate. They want to be choosing some plant-based protein. That might mean that you put edamame on your salad instead of chicken once a week. That's
Right.
probably not going to be enough to have a significant impact on your hot flashes or your cholesterol, but it still, quote unquote, counts because we don't always have to measure everything, especially if we have more broad goals that soy might fit into versus specific ones.
Okay, so that's good to know. One of my favorite quotes in your book was the first problem for all of us, men and women, is not to learn, but to unlearn.
Yeah, I love that Gloria quote.
I I loved that. So what are some things, I know one of the things you mentioned women needing to unlearn is kind of that connection between food and weight during perimenopause and menopause, but like how do you unlearn the things that are in your head? I mean, I grew up sort of like you in that diet culture. And, as soon as you hit puberty, it was like, oh, no, your body was great when you were 10. What is
Mhm,
changing at 15? And, I can still see it in where I work. It's like, oh, they've always been thin. And then
mhm.
they hit puberty, so something was wrong. And so it's hard to unlearn those messages.
It is, and I mean, this is a part of a much bigger societal cultural problem about bodies and the stories that we believe. I like to certainly give the Gen X generation and really anybody, but our generation that grew up with the Golden Girls, for example, and wonderful characters like Blanche Devereaux, who were terrified of gaining weight and not meeting a man. We had all of these influences that I think really formed our beliefs about bodies. And that's not even talking about what we might have been seeing in our homes and with our families and with our peers. And so the unlearning is who is benefiting from us continuing to believe that?
Mm.
It's not us. So I would really like to, say if you've spent the first half of your life trying to have a body that is pleasing to somebody else, but you've never been happy in it, then if not now, when? So really bringing it back to what kind of life do you want to live? Because we're going to spend 30 or 40% of our life in postmenopause. Do you want to be fighting your body the whole time, or do you want to learn to live in it?
Ah, I love that. And I think you mentioned too, like some people might say, oh, well, I've been doing it wrong for so long. Is it too late for me? Is it
Yeah,
too late for me to start making deposits into my health? And I think, you had some great advice in the book about that. It's not too late.
never too late. And I mean, when we're talking about things that we're adding in for health, whether that's behaviors or food, it's still never going to be 100% guarantee. We know everybody knows somebody who has done all the right things and had something happen. So this is where I like to bring it back to if you're putting 100% of your time, your energy, and your effort into food, movement, and health, you need to know that At best, you're going to get a 35% return on that investment because of the determinants of health. So we want to make it proportional. And, I think we want to have some level of investment in our autonomy and what we can choose. But it is never too late, but it also isn't the only thing that matters.
I am so glad you said that because I feel like so many of us focus on exercise and nutrition as the key, the prescription that's going to change everything, that's going to prevent every bad thing. And then when it doesn't work, it's like we failed. What did we do wrong? But really, it's only at best 35%.
Yeah. And I mean, that's, World Health Organization level data about what we know about the determinants of health and their impact on longevity. And so when we talk about longevity medicine and how to live a long and happy life, money is really what drives that for most people. And so when we have people who are stressing out about what they should eat and whether it should be organic or not, that's not the needle mover on longevity and health for most people. If it's a value that's important to you, I am never going to tell someone not to listen to their values. And that might be a value for a lot of reasons, but it makes food less accessible in many ways. And if somebody isn't eating apples because they only feel like they can eat organic apples, then in 5 years from now, they would have been better off just eating apples, regardless of where they
Right.
came
Yeah, and it's sort of, freeing for someone to say, you don't have to keep carrying the burden of giving 100% of your effort to this. Like, enjoy your family and find joyful movement, find things that you like
from.
versus feeling like somehow you can control outcomes with this one thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So that kind of leads us into the mental health piece. I like that you talked about building kind of a scaffolding of mental health. And that there's different pillars we should be thinking about. And especially with that increased anxiety or depression during the perimenopause and menopausal times, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I mean, the great thing is that we actually have quite a bit of data on mental health in general and nutrition. We understand that that scaffolding of, having your basic needs met is important. And then once those basic needs are met, we can then look at what else can we add in that might have either reducing our risk of anxiety, depression, or reducing our risk of dementia or brain fog. And that's where the Mediterranean pattern, as I prefer to call it, instead of Mediterranean diet, has quite a bit of research built in, supporting it. And so we're looking at foods that are rich in omega-3 fats, whether that is fish, which is, the typical one that most people hear about, but also the plant-based sources of alpha linoleic acid. So all omega-3 fat foods, which can be seeds, nuts, or fish, are part of that scaffolding and can help to support mental health. We also are looking at plants in general, so just more plants on your plate. It doesn't always have to be the top of the pyramid type ones. It can really be, what you enjoy, what you have access to, and just what you're going to want to choose regularly, because the pattern matters so much more than I ate, 6 cups of kale in 2 days. Like that is not the needle mover when it comes to mental health. But yeah, so those are kind of some of the basics. But a lot of what we're talking about with mental health and menopause and perimenopause is this new onset. And so for many people, if you have had a history of anxiety or depression, including postpartum anxiety or depression, then your risk is significantly increased. And learning about that and learning about the scaffolding for mental health can be really helpful. But it's equally important to recognize that for people who have never had anxiety or depression, they still have an increased risk. And risks are hormonally driven, and we can't balance hormones with food. So important for people to recognize that, to take the pressure off their plate. Then that's why I say, like, the nutrition in the food is scaffolding, but it's not medicine. And so many women suffer for a really long time because they feel like it's something they're doing wrong. So I always like to point that out.
I'm glad you said that because sometimes there's stigma still around taking certain medications or even hormone therapy.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really necessary. I mean, we can say food is medicine to an extent, but I think it's also a misleading statement as well.
I think
because
it puts
sometimes
too
we
much
use,
pressure on food, honestly. Like
yeah,
food is so much more than just medicine. Like, when we're
right.
trying to build this inclusive definition or working definition of food, it is so much more than just nutrition. And
Hmm.
it puts so much pressure on our plate when it's, oh, I have to eat this or I can only eat this, otherwise XYZ will or won't happen. But yeah, and I think that there is a lot of stigma around mental health, but there's also a lot of misdiagnosis. And so when we were talking earlier about diagnosis around perimenopause, a lot of women, and we have research to back this up, are, told that it's just their hormones, they're just tired, they're just anxious, they're just depressed, they're not appropriately diagnosed or treated.
Which is so sad. So it really becomes about advocating for yourself.
Yeah. And that's where the education piece comes in. So, if we think about pregnancy, if we would declare it a public health failure, if 50% of the women who became pregnant had no idea that they were pregnant, right? And
Yes.
yet we have data from around the world, essentially, that at least 50% of women feel like blindsided by perimenopause or feel like they were not given the education or have no idea what to look for. In some studies, up to 80 or 90% had no idea they were in perimenopause until they were in it. So education needs to happen on an individual level, but also it needs to come from governments and organizations. And we really need to prioritize this level of education as part of reproductive education that is happening, when we're talking about, sex education and birth control. We also need to be talking about perimenopause and menopause.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Wouldn't it be so nice if you knew what to expect, or at least you knew that it wasn't just you?
Yeah, exactly.
One thing you mentioned with intuitive eating was that intuitive eaters often have better blood pressure and cholesterol and glucose levels. That seems counterintuitive to what most people believe, because a lot of women, at least that I talk to, will say, "Oh my gosh, intuitive eating sounds great, but for me, all I would eat is French fries and ice cream. I couldn't do it." And
Yeah.
yet, we're seeing an improvement in these health markers.
Yeah.
What do you
And
say?
these are associations. We don't to be completely transparent, it's very difficult to have these kinds of studies as randomized, controlled human trials where we're, pitting diet culture against intuitive eating. But when we're looking at associations, what we see is that people who score higher on the validated intuitive eating assessment scales tend to have significantly lower or better outcomes with these types of conditions. And I think a lot of it comes down to the impact of stress. And so if we
Mm,
have somebody who feels a lot of stress and anxiety about what they're eating and when they're eating and their weight, that stress is going to have a negative impact. But also if we look at just eating behavior, if anybody's been on vacation, this is probably the best example I can use to kind of counter the I would only eat French fries argument, which I often hear too, is when you go on vacation and you're so happy those first few days of vacation to eat at the restaurants and to have, access to all these new foods and different fun eating experiences. By the end of the vacation, you just can't wait to get home and just eat what you normally eat, right? You just can't wait to be just like eat normally or be a normal eater. And that is, I think, a tangible example for people to see that you can self-regulate even when you have access to new foods, fun foods. But the key is practicing permission and not restricting foods that you enjoy. And so if
mm,
French fries is something that you enjoy, there will always be a way forward with eating that can include them. And
mm,
that's the practicing yes and really learning that food is so much more than just nutrition. It is very important, obviously, but we don't have to. I just would love to see us as a society move away from this idea of perfect eating, because anybody
mm.
who food and health, like dietitians, knows that perfect eating doesn't exist.
Yeah. And it also really affects children. I mean, I've always worked in the adolescent frame. And so when I get kids at the college level and they come and they're very frightened with foods, and a lot of times they've grown up in an environment where there was so much pressure put on perfect eating that then
Yep.
when they're in the environment of a dining hall and there's all of these things around, it's very hard to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
So I think unlearning that is good for ourselves, but also if we have kids, it's great for our families.
Yes, food
Um,
peace all around.
yes. I mean, I know we have to wrap things up, but if you could say, obviously everybody needs to get the book and look at it because there's such great tips in it. Top three pieces of advice you'd give to women who are kind of entering this phase or in this phase, this midlife phase, what would you say?
Well, to what we've been talking about, the education piece. And, we also have data that a lot of women are getting their health and menopause education through social media and online. And obviously, I think social media has its upsides and it can be a very positive space. We also know that there's a lot of misinformation. And so before you act on something, make sure that the information you have is correct. And so, whether that is consulting a trusted source or whether that is working with somebody one to one, just try and limit the noise that comes into your decision making space about health in general, but especially health and food. That would kind of be the first one. Two is to remember that we will be in this postmenopausal stage for hopefully many decades. And so this isn't like a 9-month pregnancy. This isn't going to wrap up in a year and be all done. This is a new life stage that you're entering. So give yourself some grace to learn about it, practice, and to get to know this version of you that has a new hormonal soup. It does feel different. It will probably look different. And learning to accept, cope, manage that change is, I think, probably the better skill than learning how to count protein. Probably the second one. And the third is to add in. So in my book, I like to try and teach people about these 5 buckets, these 5 key ingredients that aren't meant to be rules. They're not meant to be put on pedestals, but they're meant to be like versatile pieces of a capsule wardrobe. And so if we look at foods that are high in protein, these often also have iron, zinc, B12. If we look at foods that are high in omega-3 fats, they're also sources of protein usually. So this idea of building this kind of capsule wardrobe that covers your needs means that you have fewer decisions to make about food. And if we have fewer decisions to make about food, then that cuts down on a lot of the noise. And it's the noise that I think gets in the way of trusting ourselves. So to insource instead of outsource your decisions about food.
Oh, I love that. That's a great advice to end on. And I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.